The small town where Elena grew up was quiet and simple. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where mornings began with the sound of birds and evenings ended with warm lights glowing from small homes along narrow streets. Among those homes stood a modest little house with pale blue walls and a wooden fence that had been repaired many times over the years. The paint was fading, and the roof had a few patches where the rain had once slipped through. But to Elena, it was the most precious place in the world. That house was more than just wooden bricks. It was her childhood. It was her memories. And most importantly, it was the result of her father's entire life of hard work. Elena's father, Victor, had been raising her alone since she was a small child. After losing his wife many years ago, he devoted every moment of his life to his daughter. He worked long hours as a carpenter, fixing doors, building cabinets, and repairing roofs around town. His hands were rough and scarred from years of labor, but he never complained. Every nail he hammered and every plank he carried had one purpose: to give Elena a safe home and a better future. The little house was the proof of that promise. Victor had built much of it himself. Every corner of the house carried a story. The kitchen table where Elena did her homework. The living room wall where Victor had marked her height every year as she grew taller. The small garden where they planted flowers together every spring. To outsiders, the house looked ordinary. But to Elena and her father, it was priceless. For many years, life remained peaceful and predictable, until the day Daniel entered Elena's life. Daniel was different from anyone she had ever met. He was charming, confident, and full of big dreams. While most people in the town were satisfied with simple lives, Daniel spoke about the future with excitement. He talked about success, about building something big, about leaving the small town behind and creating a better life. At first, Elena was drawn to his passion. He made her feel like the world was bigger than the quiet streets she had always known. Their relationship grew quickly. Daniel often visited the little house, sharing stories about business ideas and opportunities in the city. He believed he could build a company that would change his life forever. But there was one problem. He didn't have the money to start. At first, Daniel only spoke about the problem in passing. But slowly, his conversations became more serious. He explained that with the right investment, his dream could become real. And if that happened, he promised Elena something incredible: a better house, a better life, a future where they would never have to struggle again. One evening, as the sun set behind the town's quiet hills, Daniel finally said the words that would change everything. He told Elena that if he could just get the money to start his business, their future would be secured. Elena's heart began to race, because she already knew where that money could come from. The house. The house her father had spent his entire life building. For days, Elena struggled with the decision. Her mind felt torn between two worlds. One was the past, the home filled with memories, laughter, and the love of her father. The other was the future, the dream Daniel promised, a life full of opportunity and success. Victor noticed the worry in his daughter's eyes. One night, while sitting quietly at the dinner table, he asked what was troubling her. When Elena finally explained Daniel's plan, the room became silent. Victor didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue, but the sadness in his eyes said more than words ever could. He gently reminded Elena that the house was more than property. It was their history, their safety, their home. But Elena's heart was already leaning toward the dream Daniel had painted. She believed in him. She believed in their future. And most of all, she believed that love required sacrifice. So a few weeks later, Elena made the hardest decision of her life. She sold the house. The day she handed over the keys felt like saying goodbye to a part of herself. As she walked through the empty rooms one last time, memories filled her mind. Her childhood laughter, her father's proud smile, the simple moments that had shaped her life. Victor stood quietly near the door, watching his daughter take one final look at the home he had built with his own hands. There were tears in his eyes, but he forced a small smile for her. Because if this was the path Elena had chosen, he would support her, even if it broke his heart. As Elena stepped outside for the last time, she held tightly to one comforting thought. She believed that someday, when Daniel's dream became reality, all of this sacrifice would be worth it. She believed love would lead them to a brighter future. But deep down, fate was already preparing a very different story. The city looked completely different from the small town Elena had grown up in. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky, and the streets were always alive with movement. Cars rushed past each other, people hurried along the sidewalks, and bright lights filled the air even after the sun went down. For Elena, everything felt new and exciting. Just a few weeks earlier, she had been walking through the quiet streets of her hometown, saying goodbye to the small house filled with childhood memories. Now she was standing beside Daniel in the middle of a city that never seemed to sleep. Daniel looked happier than she had ever seen him. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he talked about his plans. Every street they passed seemed to remind him of another opportunity. "This is where our future begins," he said one evening as they stood outside a small office building he had just rented. It wasn't very big. The paint on the walls inside was dull, and the floors creaked when they walked across them. But Daniel looked at the place as if it were the beginning of something incredible. To him, it was the first step toward his dream. Using the money from the sale of Elena's father's house, Daniel began setting up his new business. He worked day and night, making calls, meeting people, and preparing plans. Elena watched him with admiration. She felt proud, knowing that her sacrifice had made this moment possible. Many nights, they would sit together in their small apartment, talking about the future. Daniel spoke about success as if it were already waiting just around the corner. He promised Elena that one day they would own a beautiful home far bigger than the one she had given up. A home with wide windows, a garden, and rooms filled with laughter. "You trusted me when no one else did," Daniel told her more than once. "I will never forget that." Those words filled Elena's heart with warmth. She believed him completely. Life in the city wasn't easy, though. Starting a business required time and money, and Daniel needed every moment to focus on making his dream work. So Elena decided to do her part. She found small jobs around the neighborhood to help cover their daily expenses. Some days, she worked in a cafe, serving customers and cleaning tables. Other days, she helped at a small clothing shop, organizing shelves and greeting customers with a friendly smile. The work was tiring, but Elena never complained. Every time she felt exhausted, she reminded herself why she had made this choice. She had chosen love, and she believed that love meant supporting each other through difficult times. At first, Daniel still made time for her. Even after long days, he would return home and tell her about the progress of his business. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a flower, a dessert, or simply a hopeful smile. Those simple moments made Elena feel that everything was moving in the right direction. But as the weeks turned into months, something slowly began to change. Daniel's business started growing faster than expected. He began meeting more investors, attending more events, and spending longer hours away from home. At first, Elena didn't mind. She understood that success required effort. But gradually, the evenings they once spent talking together became rare. Daniel often returned home late at night, looking tired and distracted. Sometimes he barely spoke before going straight to bed. Other nights, he stayed out even later, saying he had important meetings. Elena tried not to worry. She told herself that this was only a temporary phase. Businesses needed time to grow, and Daniel was simply doing what he had always promised, working hard to build their future. Still, small moments began to feel different. Daniel stopped sharing as many details about his work. When Elena asked questions, his answers were shorter than before. His warm laughter became less frequent, and the quiet apartment sometimes felt a little too empty. One evening, Elena sat alone by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. The noise of traffic echoed faintly from the street below. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ignore the strange feeling growing inside her chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was simply a quiet loneliness she couldn't explain. But Elena quickly pushed the feeling away. She reminded herself of the promises Daniel had made. She remembered the excitement in his voice when he talked about their future. Most importantly, she remembered the choice she had made. Sacrifice was never meant to be easy. If love truly meant building a life together, then moments of struggle were only part of the journey. So Elena took a deep breath and smiled to herself. She would continue believing in Daniel. She would continue believing in the dream they had started together, even if, somewhere deep in her heart, a small voice had begun to whisper that something was slowly changing. At first, Daniel's business began to grow slowly. But soon, things started moving faster than anyone expected. New clients arrived one after another. Investors became interested in Daniel's ideas. His small office turned into a busy place where meetings happened almost every day. For Daniel, it felt like the beginning of everything he had dreamed about. For Elena, it felt like proof that her sacrifice had not been in vain. She often stood quietly at the door of his office after work, watching him speak confidently with people wearing expensive suits. His voice sounded stronger now, more certain. People listened to him with respect. And each time Elena saw that, her heart filled with pride. She told herself that this success belonged to both of them. After all, she had believed in Daniel when no one else did. But as Daniel's success grew, something else began to grow as well. His ego. At first, the changes were small. He started dressing differently, wearing expensive watches and tailored jackets. His conversations slowly shifted from dreams to numbers, profits, and powerful connections. Then the long work hours became even longer. Daniel was no longer just busy. He was almost never home. Many nights, Elena waited for him at the small apartment they had once filled with laughter and plans for the future. The food on the table would grow cold while the clock ticked quietly on the wall. Sometimes Daniel would send a short message saying he had another meeting. Other times, he said nothing at all. When he finally came home, he often looked distracted. His mind seemed to be somewhere else. Elena tried to stay patient. She reminded herself that success demanded sacrifice. Maybe this was simply the price they had to pay before their life finally became easier. But deep down, she began to feel something changing between them. Daniel no longer shared his thoughts the way he used to. The warm conversations they once had late at night slowly disappeared. In their place was silence. Then came the phone calls. At first, Elena barely noticed them. Daniel's phone rang constantly because of his growing business. But gradually, something about those calls felt different. Sometimes he would step outside the room to answer them. Other times, he lowered his voice so she couldn't hear what he was saying. And whenever Elena asked who had called, Daniel would simply say it was business and quickly change the subject. The distance between them grew day by day. Elena began to feel like a stranger inside the life she had helped build. One evening, as she returned home from work earlier than usual, she noticed something strange. Daniel wasn't in the apartment, but his phone was sitting on the kitchen table. The screen suddenly lit up with a new message. Elena didn't mean to look, but her eyes caught the name before she could turn away. The message was from someone named Sophie. The words were short, but they felt like a sharp knife cutting through her chest. "Can't wait to see you tonight." Elena's hands began to tremble. Her mind tried to find another explanation. Maybe Sophie was a business partner. Maybe it was just an innocent message. But something deep inside her already knew the truth. Later that night, when Daniel finally returned home, Elena was waiting. The room felt heavy with silence. Her heart pounded as she asked him about the message. For a moment, Daniel froze. Then his expression changed. The warmth that once filled his eyes disappeared. Instead of denying it, he simply sighed, as if the conversation was an inconvenience. The truth came out slowly, but painfully clear. Daniel had been seeing someone else. Someone from the wealthy business circles he had recently joined. Someone who, according to him, understood his new life better. The words hit Elena like a storm. Her mind flashed back to everything she had sacrificed. The house her father built with his own hands. The quiet life she had left behind. The trust she had placed in Daniel without hesitation. And now, standing in the middle of that small apartment, she finally saw the truth she had refused to face. Daniel had changed. Or perhaps this was who he had always been. When Elena asked him how he could do this after everything she had given up for him, Daniel's response was cold. He told her that people change, that his life had moved forward, and that she simply no longer fit into it. Those words shattered something deep inside Elena. She had believed their love was strong enough to survive anything. But to Daniel, it had become nothing more than a memory from a different chapter of his life. The conversation ended with a painful reality. Daniel asked Elena to leave. Not angrily, not cruelly, just with the calm indifference of someone who had already moved on. Within a few hours, the life Elena had built around him collapsed completely. She packed the few belongings she had left. The apartment no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where her dreams had quietly died. As she stepped out into the cold city night, Elena felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She had no house to return to, no savings to rely on, and no partner beside her. The man she had sacrificed everything for had walked away without looking back. Standing under the dim glow of a streetlight, Elena finally understood the painful truth. She had given up her past, her security, and her father's legacy for someone who had never truly valued her love. And now, she was left alone in a city that suddenly felt colder and larger than ever before. But deep within the silence of that lonely night, a new chapter of Elena's life was quietly waiting to begin. The first few days after Elena left the apartment felt like a long, dark night that refused to end. The city that once looked bright and exciting now felt cold and unfamiliar. The tall buildings that had once filled her with hope now seemed to surround her like silent walls. She walked the crowded streets, carrying a small bag with her few remaining belongings. Cars rushed past her. People hurried to their destinations, and no one noticed the quiet pain written across her face. For the first time since she arrived in the city, Elena felt completely alone. The man she had trusted with her heart had pushed her out of his life as if she meant nothing. The dream she once believed in had disappeared overnight, and now she had nowhere to go. Elena managed to rent a tiny room in an old building on the edge of the city. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a small table. The walls were thin, and the windows rattled whenever the wind blew. But it was the only place she could afford. Each night, she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling above her. Sleep rarely came easily. Her thoughts returned again and again to the choices she had made. The house, her father, the quiet life she had left behind. Those memories now felt like distant echoes from another world. Sometimes Elena closed her eyes and imagined walking through the old wooden door of the house again. She could almost smell the familiar scent of her father's cooking in the kitchen. She remembered the garden where they planted flowers together every spring. She remembered the way her father used to smile proudly whenever he looked at the home he had built with his own hands. And every time those memories returned, a heavy wave of guilt filled her chest. Her father had tried to warn her. He had never forced her to change her mind, but his quiet hesitation had said everything. He knew the house was more than just property. It was their safety, their history, their future, and she had given it away without fully understanding what she was losing. Many nights, Elena sat by the small window in her room and thought about going back to her hometown. She imagined standing in front of her father again. But every time the thought came, another feeling followed close behind. Shame. What would she say to him? How could she explain that the man she sacrificed everything for had simply walked away? The idea of facing her father with that painful truth felt almost impossible. So instead, Elena stayed where she was. And each day became a quiet fight for survival. She woke up early every morning, searching for any job she could find. Some days she cleaned offices after closing hours. Other days, she worked long shifts at small restaurants, washing dishes or carrying heavy trays. The work was exhausting. Her hands often ached, and her feet burned after hours of standing. But Elena never complained, because slowly, something inside her began to change. At first, she worked simply to survive. But as the weeks passed, she began to feel a different kind of strength growing inside her. Every difficult day she survived reminded her of something important. She had lost many things, but she had not lost herself. Elena started saving every small amount of money she earned. The process was slow, but it gave her a quiet sense of control over her life again. For the first time in a long while, she was building something with her own effort, not for someone else's dream, but for her own future. One evening, after finishing a long shift at a local cafe, Elena sat alone with a cup of tea in her hands. The city lights outside the window shimmered softly in the darkness. For the first time since Daniel had betrayed her, Elena allowed herself to breathe without feeling completely broken. Yes, she had made mistakes. Yes, she had trusted someone who did not deserve it. But those mistakes did not define the rest of her life. Slowly, Elena began to understand something powerful. True strength does not come from never falling. It comes from learning how to stand up again after everything has fallen apart. The road ahead was still uncertain. Her life was far from perfect. But somewhere deep inside her heart, a quiet determination had begun to grow. And although Elena did not know it yet, this painful chapter of regret was slowly becoming the beginning of a much stronger woman. Time has a quiet way of changing people. For Elena, the years that followed were not easy, but they slowly shaped her into someone stronger than she had ever imagined. At first, every day still felt like a struggle. She worked long hours, saving every small amount of money she could. Some mornings she woke up before sunrise, and many nights she returned to her small room long after the streets had grown quiet. But she kept moving forward, one day at a time, one step at a time. The pain from the past never disappeared completely, but it slowly lost its power over her. Months turned into years, and little by little, Elena's life began to change. Her hard work at the cafe did not go unnoticed. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, often watched Elena carefully as she worked. Elena never arrived late. She never complained, and she treated every customer with kindness and respect, even on the most exhausting days. One afternoon, after closing the cafe, Mrs. Carter called Elena into the small office behind the kitchen. Elena felt nervous as she stepped inside, unsure what to expect. But instead of criticism, she received an opportunity. Mrs. Carter had noticed Elena's dedication and offered her a better position managing the front counter and helping with daily operations. It wasn't a huge promotion, but for Elena, it meant stability. It meant progress. And most importantly, it meant someone believed in her effort. Elena accepted the responsibility with quiet determination. She worked even harder than before, learning new skills and improving every part of her job. She studied how businesses worked, how to handle customers, and how to solve problems calmly. Slowly, her confidence began to grow. For the first time in years, Elena started to feel proud of the life she was building. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Every step forward came from her own effort. Every small success belonged to her alone. Over time, Elena saved enough money to move into a slightly larger apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt warm and safe. The new place had a small balcony where she could sit in the evenings and watch the city lights. Sometimes she sat there quietly, thinking about how far she had come. The memories of Daniel still appeared in her mind from time to time, but they no longer filled her with anger. Instead, they reminded her of the lessons she had learned. Trust must be earned. Love should never demand the loss of your dignity. And true strength often grows from the most painful experiences. As Elena continued working at the cafe, she also began noticing people around her who were struggling just as she once had. Young workers trying to start their lives. Customers who looked tired and worried about money. New employees who felt overwhelmed by their responsibilities. Instead of turning away, Elena chose to help them whenever she could. She listened to their stories. She encouraged them during difficult days. Sometimes she even shared pieces of her own past, reminding them that failure did not mean the end of everything. Her kindness slowly became known among the people who worked with her. Many began to respect her not only for her work ethic, but also for her compassion. Without realizing it, Elena had become someone others could rely on. Someone strong, someone wise. The pain she once carried had transformed into something meaningful. It had taught her how to understand the struggles of others. And in helping them, she found a new sense of purpose. Yet even as Elena built a new life, the past never disappeared completely. Occasionally, she heard bits of news about Daniel. At first, his business continued growing. His company became well-known in certain circles, and his name appeared in business conversations across the city. But success, like many things in life, can be fragile. One evening, while serving customers at the cafe, Elena overheard two businessmen talking quietly at a nearby table. They spoke about a company that had once been rising quickly but was now facing serious problems. Investors were pulling out, projects were failing, and rumors of dishonest deals were spreading. Elena didn't need to hear the name to know who they were talking about. Daniel. For a brief moment, the old memories returned. The promises, the betrayal, the night she walked away with nothing. But the feeling that followed surprised her. It wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't revenge. Instead, Elena simply felt calm. Life had taken both of them down very different paths. Daniel had chased success with pride and ambition. Elena had rebuilt her life through patience and humility. Standing behind the cafe counter that evening, Elena quietly realized something important. The woman she had become was no longer the same girl who once sacrificed everything for someone else's dream. She was stronger now, wiser, and far more certain of her own worth. Little did she know, however, that fate was slowly preparing to bring her face to face with Daniel once again. And when that moment finally arrived, both of their lives would change in ways neither of them could expect. Years had passed since Elena last saw Daniel. Life had slowly moved forward, carrying her far away from the painful memories of the past. The city that once felt cold and lonely had gradually become familiar and safe. Elena had built a quiet but steady life. Every morning, she arrived at the cafe before the doors opened. She prepared the tables, greeted the staff with a warm smile, and welcomed the first customers of the day. Her routine was simple, but it gave her peace. One evening, just as the sun was setting behind the tall buildings, the cafe was unusually busy. The soft sound of conversations filled the room, along with the clinking of cups and plates. Elena moved from table to table, helping customers and making sure everything ran smoothly. As she carried a tray toward the front counter, the door of the cafe slowly opened. At first, she didn't pay much attention. New customers walked in all the time, but something about the man standing at the entrance made her pause. He looked tired. His clothes were wrinkled, and his posture seemed heavy, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. His hair, once neatly styled, now looked unkempt. For a brief moment, Elena's heart skipped a beat. The face was older, worn by time and worry, but it was a face she knew very well. Daniel. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The noise of the cafe faded into the background as their eyes met across the room. Daniel looked shocked. It was clear he had not expected to see her there. And for a moment, Elena could see something in his expression she had never seen before. Regret. Slowly, Daniel walked toward the counter. Each step seemed uncertain, almost hesitant. The confident businessman Elena once knew had disappeared. In his place stood a man who looked lost. When he finally stopped in front of her, there was an awkward silence between them. Daniel looked at Elena carefully, as if trying to understand how much time had changed her. She looked calm, strong, composed, very different from the heartbroken woman he had left years ago. Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. He asked how she had been. Elena answered politely, keeping her tone steady. There was no anger in her voice, but there was also no warmth. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, as if struggling to find the right words. Eventually, he began to explain what had happened to him. His business had grown quickly, but the success had not lasted. Bad decisions, risky deals, and dishonest partners had slowly destroyed everything he had built. The investors who once praised him had disappeared. The wealthy friends who once surrounded him had vanished the moment his company began to collapse. In the end, Daniel had been left with nothing. As he spoke, his voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and regret. It was clear that life had not been kind to him. After a long pause, Daniel admitted something he had probably never imagined saying. He told Elena that losing her had been the biggest mistake of his life. He He confessed that he often thought about the past, about the woman who had believed in him when he had nothing, about the sacrifice she had made for his dream. Daniel said he now understood how much he had lost. For a moment, silence filled the space between them again. But Elena's reaction surprised him. She didn't look angry. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply listened. Her face remained calm, her posture steady. The pain she once felt had already healed. Daniel's words no longer held power over her emotions. The man standing before her was no longer someone she depended on. He was simply a person from her past, a chapter of her life that had already ended. As Daniel finished speaking, he looked at her with hope in his eyes, as if waiting for something. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps another chance. But Elena only gave him a quiet, thoughtful look. The cafe had grown quieter as the evening moved on. Most of the customers had already left, and the warm lights inside the room created a calm and peaceful atmosphere. Outside the windows, the city lights flickered softly in the distance. Daniel stood across from Elena, still searching her face for a reaction. For years, he had imagined this moment differently. He had always believed that if they ever met again, Elena would still be the same woman who once loved him deeply, the woman who would forgive him easily. But the person standing before him now was very different. Elena looked calm and confident. The sadness that once filled her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena finally broke the silence. Her voice was steady and thoughtful. She told Daniel that there was something he had never known, something about the house she had sold years ago. Daniel frowned slightly, confused by the sudden change in the conversation. For him, the house had always been just the money that helped start his business. Nothing more. But for Elena, it had always meant far more than that. She explained that before the house had been sold, her father had done something unexpected. Victor had always been a careful man. Even though he trusted his daughter, he also understood how uncertain life could be. So when the paperwork for the house was prepared, he quietly made sure that a small portion of the land's ownership remained legally protected under Elena's name. At the time, Elena had barely thought about it. She had been too focused on helping Daniel achieve his dream. But her father had seen something she had not. He had wanted to protect her future, just in case life did not go the way she hoped. Daniel listened carefully, his expression slowly changing. Elena continued speaking. Years after the house was sold, the quiet little town where she had grown up began to change. Large companies started buying land in the area to build new shopping centers, offices, and housing developments. The land where her old house once stood became part of that expansion. What had once been a simple piece of property suddenly became extremely valuable. And because of the small portion of ownership her father had protected, Elena still had a legal claim connected to that land. At first, Elena had been shocked when she discovered it. But instead of ignoring the opportunity, she chose to handle it carefully. She spoke with lawyers and financial advisors. She learned how investments worked and how to manage the unexpected wealth responsibly. Over time, the value of the land continued to rise. Eventually, Elena was able to reclaim her share of the property and invest the money wisely. The financial stability she now had did not come from luck alone. It came from patience, learning, and the quiet protection her father had left behind. Daniel stood frozen as he listened. The realization slowly spread across his face. The house he once thought was nothing more than a sacrifice had actually become the very foundation of Elena's new life. The same house he had convinced her to sell. The same house he had never truly respected. Elena looked at him calmly. There was no pride in her voice, no desire to impress him. She was simply telling the truth. Today, she explained, she was financially secure. She no longer struggled to survive. She had built a stable and independent life. And the house that once felt like her greatest loss had, in the end, become one of the greatest blessings her father could have left behind. Daniel lowered his head slowly. For the first time in many years, he fully understood the depth of what he had thrown away. But Elena's story was not finished yet, because the final choice she was about to make would reveal just how much she had truly changed. Daniel stood quietly in the cafe, his head lowered as Elena's words slowly sank in. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt calm, almost too calm, as if the world outside had paused to let the truth settle between them. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the room before returning to Elena's face. The confident man who once believed he controlled his destiny now looked humbled by everything life had taken from him. Finally, he spoke. His voice was softer than Elena had ever heard before. He admitted that he had made terrible mistakes. Success had blinded him. When his business began growing, he believed he no longer needed the people who had supported him at the beginning. He thought wealth and power would bring him happiness. But instead, it had taken away the most important thing he ever had. Daniel looked directly at Elena, his expression filled with regret. He told her that she had been the only person who truly believed in him when he was still nobody. She had trusted him without hesitation. She had sacrificed her past to help him build a future. And he had repaid that love with betrayal. The realization clearly weighed heavily on him. For years, Daniel had chased success, believing it would make him feel complete. But standing in that quiet cafe now, he understood something he had ignored for too long. He had lost the one person who cared about him without conditions. Elena listened patiently as he spoke. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness in her voice. The pain she once carried had already been transformed into something else, something calmer, stronger. When Daniel finished speaking, Elena took a slow breath. She told him that forgiveness was something she had learned over time. Holding on to anger had only made her pain heavier. Letting go of that anger had allowed her to move forward. So yes, she said quietly, she forgave him. But forgiveness did not mean going back. Some doors, once closed, were never meant to open again. Elena explained that the woman who once loved Daniel had changed. Life had taught her lessons she could never forget. She had learned that love should never require losing yourself. She had learned that true strength comes from standing on your own feet. And strangely enough, she also realized that the painful chapter Daniel created in her life had helped her discover who she truly was. Without that heartbreak, she might never have found the courage to rebuild her life. For that reason, Elena thanked him, not for the pain he caused, but for the lesson it eventually taught her. Daniel looked surprised by those words, but Elena simply gave a small, peaceful smile. The past no longer controlled her. With calm confidence, she stepped away from the counter and walked toward the cafe door. Daniel watched her carefully, understanding that this moment was not just a goodbye. It was the closing of a chapter he could never rewrite. Before stepping outside, Elena paused for a brief moment. Her thoughts drifted back to her father, to the man who had quietly protected her future without expecting anything in return. The house he had built with love had once felt like a painful loss. But now Elena understood something deeper. That sacrifice had not destroyed her life. Instead, it had guided her towards strength, wisdom, and independence. Elena stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights glowing softly around her. For the first time in many years, her heart felt completely at peace. She walked forward with quiet dignity, carrying her father's memory with pride and understanding that the greatest legacy he had given her was not the house itself, but the strength to rise again, no matter how hard life tried to break her.